Hello, and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr. McDonald. In this episode, I'll be looking at and discussing the sections of the compassionate and of the priests in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And I'll also have a discussion of the examples of Beauty and the Beast and Toy Story for the section of the compassionate, and a discussion of faith versus science for the section of the priests. So let's get started then. Of the compassionate. My friends, your friend has heard a satirical saying. Just look at Zarathustra. Does he not go among us as if among animals? But it's better said like this. The enlightened man goes among men as among animals. The enlightened man calls man himself the animal with red cheeks. How did this happen to man? Is it not because he has had to be ashamed too often? Ah, my friends, thus speaks the enlightened man. Shame, shame, shame. That is the history of man. And for that reason, the noble man resolves not to make others ashamed. He resolves to feel shame before all sufferers. Truly, I do not like them. The compassionate who are happy in their compassion. They are too lacking in shame. If I must be compassionate, I still do not want to be called compassionate. And if I am compassionate, then it is preferably from a distance. And I should also prefer to cover my head and flee away before I am recognized. And thus I bid you do, my friends. May my destiny ever lead across my path only those who, like you, do not sorrow or suffer, and those with whom I can have hope and repast and honey in common. Truly I did this and that for the afflicted, but it will always seem to me I did things better when I learned to enjoy myself better. As long as men have existed, man has enjoyed himself too little. That alone, my brothers, is our original sin. And if we learn to better enjoy ourselves, we best unlearn how to do harm to others and to contrive harm. Therefore I wash my hand when it has helped a sufferer. Therefore I wipe my soul clean as well. So immediately we have this relation of man or humanity to animals. And this is important because we have the sense of what makes us exactly different from animals, and how are we able to elevate our own sense of intellect and superiority over animals. And from all that we have the sense of shame here coming in, compassion as well that we have from shame. So one way of putting it as well is always feeling like the need to have a sense of care and love and taking care of those for people who are in a different situation from ourselves, of course. And it goes into those sort of ideas of the have and have nots, and those who, of course, have everything, let's say, house, stable income, and so forth, will feel compassion for those that have not, that don't have a stable income and so forth. And hence why you have the whole Christian ideas coming forth and through of charity and looking after those who are poor and so on. And it's in the sense here that we say, well, man is an animal who ultimately reflects upon itself as something that is ashamed of itself in a way, which is interesting, because if you think what Nietzsche is saying here is that when we look upon any animal whatsoever, then it doesn't have that reflective qualities to have that capacity to reflect upon its own situation. It's quite happy and content in what it does and doesn't feel any remorse and so forth. It just goes about its everyday business, like a lion will just kill a gazelle or whatever it is and just does the action happily and contently in order to survive and so on. But here we say, well, man is ultimately an animal that has that critical reflective capacity, and in doing so we reflect upon our actions and we feel ashamed about ourselves and what we do and what we have in such a way that animals don't. And from all that as well, we also have the sense of enabling ourselves from all that to then sort of elevate ourselves above sort of our animality, in the sense of, because we're able to reflect upon our own actions, then we can say, well, this action is wrong because I feel compassion and emotion towards my fellow man, let's say, or woman. Then I can feel the fact that they're done wrong and harm's created. And so you can have, like, say, at the very bare basic sense of it as well, that's how ethical models and senses of morality all emerge, is all through our sense of that critical reflection upon actions and the emotions that we feel in having seen wrong done to others, and the benefits therefore done to others, and feeling good about having helped someone else and cared for someone else. And so what's interesting as well is that Nietzsche then starts to reflect upon the psychological problems that sort of entailed with being compassionate. And so a great problem from all that as well that Nietzsche highlights on the psychological level is that ultimately we put the happiness of others before ourselves, that we're so caught up in compassionate and care and love for another person that ultimately we could be unhappy ourselves and in a real bad state from a mental health point of view as well. Let's say, for example, you can have a very fantastic, amazing charity worker who does so much amazing things for other people, but they themselves are in a continual state of depression and need help for that, of course. Then that's Nietzsche's point, to say, well, we can do amazing, compassionate things for people, but we also need to think about ourselves as well there. What about needing to address that mental health issue there? And so the next little part builds up the psychological profiling and description of those who are compassionate as well, from both ends, from the caring point of the person giving care and those receiving care as well. So continuing on, for I saw the sufferer suffer, and because I saw it, I was ashamed on account of his shame. And when I helped him, then I sorely injured his pride. Great obligations do not make a man grateful. They make him resentful, and if a small kindness is not forgotten, it becomes a gnawing worm. Be reserved in accepting. Honor a man by accepting from him. Thus I advise those who have nothing to give. I, however, am a giver. I give gladly as a friend to friends. But strangers and the poor may pluck the fruit from my tree for themselves. It causes less shame that way. Beggars, however, should be entirely abolished. Truly is annoying to give to them, and annoying not to give to them, and likewise sinners and bad consciences. Believe me, my friends, stings of conscience teach one to sting. But worst of all are petty thoughts. Truly, better even to have done wickedly than to have thought pettily. To be sure, you will say, delight in petty wickedness spares us many a great evil deed, but here one should not wish to be spared. The evil deed is like a boil, it itches and irritates and breaks forth, it speaks honourably. Behold, I am a disease, thus speaks the evil deed. That is its honesty. But the petty thought is like a canker. It creeps and hides and wants to appear nowhere until the whole body is rotten and withered by little cankers. But I whisper this advice in the ear of him possessed of a devil. Better for you to rear your devil. There is a way to greatness even for you. Ah, my brothers, one knows a little too much about everybody. And many a one who has become transparent to us is still for a long time invulnerable. It is hard to live with men because keeping silent is so hard. And we are the most fair, not towards him whom we do not like, but towards him for whom we feel nothing at all. But if you have a suffering friend, be a resting place for his suffering, but a resting place like a hard bed, a camp bed. Thus you will serve him best. And should your friend do you a wrong, then say, I forgive you what you did to me, but that you did it to yourself, how could I forgive that? Thus speaks all great love. It overcomes even forgiveness and pity. One should hold fast to one's heart, for if one lets it go, how soon one loses one's head too. Alas, where in the world have there been greater follies than with the compassionate? And what in the world has caused more suffering than the follies of the compassionate? Woe to all lovers who cannot surmount pity. Thus spoke the devil to me once. Even God has his hell. It is his love for man. And I lately heard him say these words, God is dead. God has died of his pity for man. So be warned against pity. Thence shall yet come a heavy cloud for man. Truly I understand weather signs. But mark too this saying, all great love is above pity, for it wants to create what is loved. I offer myself to my love, and my neighbour as myself. That is the language of all creators. All creators, however, are hard. Thus spoke Zarathustra. So then we have that wonderful psychological profiling occurring in which you have problems from both sides. You have the whole sort of argument that you can have that by giving the person aid, then the person receiving the aid, of course, has their pride injured on that. And there's almost that sense of sort of belittling who the person is within their own minds as well, in the sense of they no longer is that passionate person that they used to be, but having then not been that great person because they needed to receive aid in the first place and help from another person. And then there's also the whole obligation and need to care, as he says there as well, in the sense of that need to give aid makes people incredibly resentful towards giving and being charitable in the first place. And you can have that in the sense of whenever they have on television in a yearly fashion, at least here in the UK, we have two great big TV examples of comic relief and children in need. And it's the whole sense as well, you can see there the whole point about becoming resentful in the sense of having to continually always give charity every single year to it. And it's sort of the critical question you can have in your own mind. Why do I need to keep on giving money again and again and again and again when so much money has been raised in the first place over a course of several decades as well? Why do I need to keep on giving charity all the time? Surely we can invest it in such a thing that will then be more beneficial for the people needing aid and so forth, rather than to continually give money all the time. And so you can become incredibly resentful towards the idea of giving and being charitable there. And then we also have the whole sense as well in giving and being compassionate and wanting to help another person. It's your conscience ultimately that teaches how to sting, in the sense of it's the little things that niggle at you and are persistent and are things that cause you anxiety and of course mental health problems. Just such questions as, did I give enough money in the first place? Or what will other people think about me having given money to this specific cause and then not other specific causes? Wait, should I not then also give to other causes as well? How much should I give? If I've given this amount, should I not give more? I hope the person receiving the aid in the first place has been given enough. And it's that continual sense of all those little niggling questions as well that then start to cause problems for your own judgment. Am I making the correct judgments here about things? Am I making the best judgment? And so Nietzsche sort of paints the picture of having the problems from both sides as well in then giving and receiving aid, having both their own sort of psychological problems. But then comes in the idea of a good friend, and what will that friend do is be like a hard bed that he says, be ultimately like a camp bed. And so was that a metaphor for just giving you that sense of tough love. And so you can say, well, what does that do? Why is that significant? Because when someone's being, of course, compassionate to another person, he's saying really here that we can lose ourselves so much in the plight of that other person that we then lose our own sort of sense of self and our own identity, our own viewpoint and opinion, and we're so charmed and loving and caring towards the other person that then we then lose sight of ourselves. And it's never to lose sight of yourself and who you are and your own view and your own opinion, because then that can be a very beneficial leeway in and help towards someone who's, of course, going through trouble, be it whatever trouble that it is, of course, because that person's more steadfast. And so they'll not try to then completely take your side. In fact, the good friend he sent there, or perhaps completely go against what you're saying and try to make you see reason, of course, and try to make you see through your own compassion and through your own emotional state that you've gotten into. And perhaps then you could say, well, their own emotional states clouded their judgment. And then from all that, you can say, well, the friends enabled them to reach to their own conclusion that they can go and do such and such a thing to make themselves remedy the wrong that they've done, or do a certain thing in order to make themselves feel better, and so on. And that whole sense of being true to sort of who you are and your own view and your own opinions about something is that he says you've really got to take control of your heart, because if you don't, then it'll take control of your head. And so it's not only in the sense of a good friend will then try to get control of you emotionally through your own compassion and emotion, but then you can also try and help yourself through that, through trying to get control of your own emotions at the same time. And if you don't, then of course we have the fantastic metaphor there of God having died because of his love for man there, in the sense of then you have a divinity having lost its divine powers, let's say, and has died because of its love for man. And we have that little nice line as well about creation and creativity coming up, in the sense of when anybody wants to create something as well, they need to be joyful and steadfast in what they uphold and their own love for things. And to create is ultimately not to be in this emotional state of compassion where suffering is going to be there, but precisely the joy of creation shows you the individuality and love that that person has for their ideas that they're trying to convey. And then through that love and the idea that they convey, we can then see, of course, the person behind all that, and then what they're working through is the problem and so forth, and all the different loveliness that's there expressed in their creation. And so I thought two good movies for this section to discuss are the Disney films Beauty and the Beast from 1991 and Toy Story from 1995. And so Beauty and the Beast will be used to illustrate the classical, traditional sort of approach for compassion and empathy. And I'll be using Toy Story as an example to illustrate what Nietzsche says about compassion in the section. So starting off with Beauty and the Beast, and here's a little summary of the plot from Google. An arrogant prince is cursed to live as a terrifying beast until he finds true love. Strangely, his chance comes when he captures an unwary clockmaker, whose place is then taken by his bold and beautiful daughter Belle. Helped by the beast's similarly enchanted servants, including a clock, a teapot, and a candelabra, Belle begins to see the sensitive soul behind the fearsome facade. But as time runs out, it soon becomes obvious that Belle's cocky suitor Gaston is the real beast of the piece. And so, for Beauty and the Beast, we have the whole idea of compassion there from the very get-go as something that if we don't have, then it ultimately makes us completely animalistic. And how the story starts off is, of course, as the prince turns away and is completely hateful and horrible towards an old woman that needs assistance and help. And so then she turns him into the beast, then showing his lack of compassion makes him no better than an animal, and so has to live in that state of being a beast until he finds his true love and someone who's going to love them and give him true love's kiss, as you do within fairy tales, of course. And within all that, we come into the whole character of then Belle, who then helps him move and transition from this animalistic beast-like state that he was from in a previous younger phase, of course, towards more maturity, and maybe making that comment as well, from childhood we're more like animals, and through our empathy and compassion for others we become more rational, and therefore becoming more rational we become adult. And it's through, of course, then his compassion and so forth, and that moves towards becoming more rational through all that, then she starts to fall in love with him, and he makes the transition, of course, from beast into, let's say, gentleman and rational being. And on the other hand, what's interesting as well is you have the idea of Gaston as an antagonist. What's interesting about Gaston and what makes him such an antagonist is his lack of compassion and empathy towards the beast as a character. Because you can say here that, well, Gaston sees the beast as a beast, purely an animal, and therefore it must die. But it's also to say at the same time, well, Gaston shouldn't surely just see the beast as purely an animal. He should empathize with it, because if he does so, then he'll himself not lower and debase himself and his own ideals back towards this sort of brutish, savage-like mentality, and rather have his own ideas elevated. And so in a way that Gaston's own death is sort of symbolic precisely of that moment in which the beast himself overcomes his own animality towards a pure symbolic form of rational man. And Gaston's own death is no better than that of ultimately a beast or animal itself. So there's an interesting, nice role reversal almost that's going on there between the two characters. Moving on to Toy Story next. So here's a little synopsis of the plot of Toy Story, again from Google. Woody, voiced by Tom Hanks, is a good-hearted cowboy doll who belongs to a young boy named Andy. Sees his position as Andy's favorite toy jeopardized when his parents buy him a Buzz Lightyear action figure, who's voiced by Tim Allen. Even worse, the arrogant Buzz thinks he's a real spaceman on a mission to return to his home planet. When Andy's family moves to a new house, Woody and Buzz must escape the clutches of a maladjusted neighbor, Sid Phillips, and reunite with their boy. And so what's great about the movie Toy Story then, it re-emphasizes that plot about having that camp bed, rock solid, well-grounded friend who can help you in a crisis because you're so emotional and compassionate, as he says. And what do we have in the movie for that is Woody is the well-rounded friend, and ultimately Buzz is the person caught up in that really compassionate, emotional state. And what does Buzz want, of course, is to go back to his mission of being a space ranger. And then, of course, he then tries to run away, and which then Woody's got to go and then find him and bring him back. And Buzz gets picked up in a crane machine, which he's mistaken as a rocket that'll think it'll send him back into space, and is taken home with the boy from across the road called Sid. And then he manages to see and very much breaks his own idea of sense of self there as well, that the fact that he's actually just a toy and is completely gutted by that whole experience, having seen an advertisement on a television as well, and all the different effects and so forth that he has, like his little laser that's just a light, and then different little pre-recorded voice sayings as well that you have on the buttons. And then they have that great sort of existential crisis in the movie of not exactly knowing who he is anymore, because his whole sense of self, of being a space ranger, is completely broken down, and that whole horror ultimately just being a toy. But that's what's then so great about Woody, is about being a well-rounded, grounded, solid individual, because he's able to help him through that crisis by saying, well, actually being a toy in the first place is not a horrible thing at all, because hey, there's lots of other toys that's there in Andy's room. There's Rex, there's the little pig, there's Mr. Potato Head and so forth. We're all there for you as well. You're not completely alone. And you get to also be Andy's toy and enjoy getting played with Andy and being part of the adventures and so on. So what's so great about Toy Story as well is that it re-emphasizes that point about friendship and the importance of getting control of your own emotions and compassionate state. And you can be so invested in something that you almost become blindsided, and then having those great friends as well that's enabling you to get control of your emotions, clear your head, and get more well-grounded back again as an individual, just like Woody helps Buzz in the movie. So I think we can see the clear difference between Beauty and the Beast and Toy Story. Beauty and the Beast, you have to focus upon a clear ethical model provided by compassion, and through that compassion, of course, you gain empathy, and then you have a higher sense of morality and being able to, through our own compassion and feelings for our fellow human beings as well, then we're able to identify what's harmful and what's good for us. And then in Toy Story, it's not focused upon that traditional ethical model, but rather a focus upon our mental health and well-being. And through working through all that, then we can arrive at being a better, more well-founded individual. And you could also use that approach again in Beauty and the Beast, where you could say, well, instead of through compassion, you could rather say develop and engage with the problems of anger and so forth that Beast has as a character, and through all that, then you engage with the mental health problems, and then he becomes a more well-founded, well-grounded individual as well. And so we have that nice clash between sort of the roles of Belle and Woody as characters. One for Belle is that classical person, allowing us to see and move past our animality in another human being towards a rational being, and in Woody allowing us to see as well a troubled individual, and then allowing us to help them in a very positive and constructive way as well to overcome their own problem and reach a much better understanding of themselves and a more well-grounded and healthier approach for them. Moving on to the next section then, of the priests. And one day Zarathustra made a sign to his disciples and spoke these words to them: "Here are priests, and although they are my enemies, pass them by quietly and with sleeping swords. There are heroes even among them. Many of them have suffered too much, so they want to make others suffer. They are bad enemies. Nothing is more vengeful than their humility, and he who touches them is easily defiled. But my blood is related to theirs, and I want to know my blood honored even in theirs." And when they had passed by, Zarathustra was assailed by a pain, and when he had not struggled long with his pain, he began to speak thus: "I pity these priests. They go against my taste too, but that means little to me since I am among men. But I suffer and have suffered with them. They seem to me prisoners and marked men. He whom they call Redeemer has cast them into bondage, into the bondage of false values and false scriptures. Ah, that someone would redeem them from their Redeemer. Once, as the sea tossed about them, they thought they had landed upon an island, but behold, it was a sleeping monster. False values and false scriptures, they are the worst monsters for mortal men. Fate sleeps and waits long within them, but at last it comes and awakes and eats and devours all that have built their huts upon it. Oh, just look at these huts that these priests have built themselves. Churches they call their sweet-smelling caves. Oh, this counterfeit light. Oh, this musty air. Here where the soul may not fly up to its height. On the contrary, their faith commands, up the steps on your knees, you sinners. Truly, I would rather see men still shameless than with the distorted eyes of their shame and devotion. Who created such caves and penitential steps? Was it not those who wanted to hide themselves and were ashamed before the clear sky? And only when the clear sky again looks through broken roofs and upon grass and red poppies on broken walls, only then will I turn my heart again towards the places of this God. They call God that which contradicted and harmed them, and truly there was much that was heroic in their worship, and they knew no other way of loving their God than by nailing men to the cross. So this section of the priests then sort of follows on and builds upon the previous sections that we've already had within part 1, and those sections are the afterworldsmen, the despisers of the body, and the preachers of death. And in the section the priests, we have again this whole criticism that Nietzsche has built up of Christianity and a religious outlook upon life. So we have a very brief psychological description there of exactly why do people as priests end up in the situation that they do, and it says it's almost because they end up in a very resentful and hateful sort of position because they've suffered. They ultimately want to bring suffering upon others as well, and through all that, of course, we then have the idea that Nietzsche refers back towards of preaching and having values that are ultimately poisonous for us. And again, why does Nietzsche think that the religious outlook is poisonous? Why is he so incredibly critical of this religious approach that emphasizes a metaphysics in the afterlife? It's because Nietzsche wants to affirm precisely the opposite of that, a move back in towards viewing the world and our body and living life in the here and now is a very incredibly positive thing, and he's incredibly critical of everything that tries to move us away from that. And in this section we have this fantastic image that Nietzsche paints of ultimately those within a religious outlook and approach, specifically Christianity, of course, he's referring to here as having become in bondage and ultimately become slaves to the very doctrine that they're worshipping and upholding and have faith in. And what do the beliefs and scripture and values that's all upheld in the first place, he says, is something that's contradictory and goes against our instinctual drives. Ultimately, he says there as well, it's worshipping things that contradict and harm us. An easy one there, for an example, is worshipping the soul and keeping the soul pure. And how do you do that as well? One way could be abstinence and being completely abstinent and keeping oneself pure and clean from any sexual engagement whatsoever. But Nietzsche's criticism of an approach that would argue for complete abstinence would be to say, well, that's a completely natural and healthy thing within our bodies that we want to go and do, basically, is to go and have intercourse and relations with another person. Is that something that's going to then make a person promiscuous or a sexual deviant? No. And we potentially can have maybe a handful of partners, maybe many partners, but just because we're sexually active doesn't therefore mean that everybody's going to be bundled into exactly the same basket, let's say, as a metaphor there, of trying to have the broad stroke to say, therefore, by allowing for sex in the first place. Suddenly everybody's going to be promiscuous. Suddenly everybody's want to go and covet your neighbor's daughter and so forth. Does everybody want to go do that? No. And then we have the great metaphor that he has there of churches resembling caves, in which you have this sort of like little cult mentality, as he's saying, in sense of everybody wants to go into the cave. Why is that the case? Because they want to get away from the world. And Nietzsche's point is exactly that. Why do you want to get away from the world? Why do you want to go inside this cave in the first place that's dark and shadowy? Should you come back out into the world? Because look at the world and the skies, he says. It's all clear and everything's wonderful in the world, but you want to stay in this dark cave. And you can't help but think of the resemblance here in the reverse way around for the famous example of Plato's cave, in which you precisely have the prisoners in the cave who then come out of the cave, or at least one of them does, and then goes into the world and suddenly sees everything as it actually is, because all what they've been able to experience is the cave and just the shadow representations of things in the world. And wouldn't it be amazing if one of them got out and able to actually see things as they were? And sort of Nietzsche's having a reversal of precisely that is a metaphor there, in the sense of where the religious approach precisely starts in the world but then wants to go back into the cave in the first place. Everybody starts off fantastically, being able to gaze upon things, have joy in the world, joy in things that is there, joy in our experience, and then we want to go into that cave and become shackled again. And it's almost that point that Nietzsche's making us think about, well, why exactly do we want to go back into that cave and become shackled again? And that fits into that wonderful metaphor that he manages to reverse around there as well. They knew no other way of loving their God than by nailing men to the cross. Of course, within Christianity, you have the cross itself as that wonderful symbol of redemption, resurrection, and so forth. But here, Nietzsche's using it as the literal symbol, of course. When you become religious and have that emphasis upon metaphysics, the afterlife and death, what you're ultimately doing is shackling people up, chaining people up, and nailing people to the cross, basically looking at everybody suffering and creating a horrible system in which people are in bondage and nailed to crosses, basically. So we get this continuation of Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity and this religious outlook as we read on for the next little bit. They thought to live as corpses. They dressed their corpses in black. Even in their speech, I still smell the evil aroma of burial vaults. And he who lives in their neighborhood lives in the neighborhood of black pools, from out of which the toad, that prophet of evil, sings its song with sweet melancholy. They would have to sing better songs to make me believe in their Redeemer. His disciples would have to look more redeemed. I should like to see them naked, for beauty alone should preach penitence. But whom could this disguised affliction persuade? Truly their Redeemers themselves did not come from freedom and from the seventh heaven of freedom. Truly they themselves never trod upon the carpets of knowledge. The spirit of their Redeemers consisted of holes, but into every hole they poured their illusion, their stopgap, which they called God. Their spirit was drowned in their pity, and when they swelled and overswelled with pity, a great folly always swarmed to the top. Zealously and with clamour they drove their herds over their bridge, as if there were only one bridge to the future. Truly these shepherds, too, still belonged among the sheep. These shepherds had small intellects and spacious souls, but, my brothers, what small countries have even the most spacious souls been up to now? They wrote letters of blood on the path they followed, and their folly taught that truth is proved by blood. But blood is the worst witness of truth. Blood poisons and transforms the purest teaching to delusion and hatred of the heart. And if someone goes through fire for his teaching, what does that prove? Truly it is more when one's own teaching comes out of one's own burning. Sultry heart and cold head, where these meet, there arises a bluster their Redeemer. Truly there have been greater men and higher born ones than those whom the people call Redeemer, those ravishing and overpowering blustering winds. And you, my brothers, must be redeemed by greater men than any Redeemer has been, if you would find the way to freedom. There has never yet been a Superman. I have seen them both naked, the greatest and the small man. They are still all too similar to one another. Truly, I found even the greatest man all too human. Thus spoke Zarathustra. So for this next little bit as well, we have this whole image that's again painted up in the sense of we have churches compared to caves, and then we have basically the religious life and outlook and the priests and so forth all living a very much zombie-like existence in which everything focuses upon death and everything focuses upon melancholies again that he says there. And we get that quite humorously a bit there in the sense of Nietzsche commenting on hymns, in which of course hymns are songs of praise and of redemption and so forth. And then Nietzsche saying, well, shouldn't they look a bit more redeemed in their singing? If only they look a bit more happier when they sung, then I'd believe precisely that they were redeemed, because they could show it, because they're nice and happy, but they're not. They're so melancholic and sad. And then we get that image again of needing to be free from bondage. And from all that, we have the idea of these shackles and bondage that's put on us through adopting that specific religious model. He's going to then say, well, what shackles it down is its lack of understanding and acceptance of knowledge, in which you have then, he says, God poured into every hole where there was denied knowledge. In the sense he's saying there, very much the argument that you have to have belief in and also acceptance of a scientific understanding for how things work. And you can't always just argue for God in every single given instance, because he's going to say as well that in the traditional sense, of course, back many thousand years ago, you could argue precisely for God because there was that blank in the first place. There was that hole to be filled. But once we know exactly how a thing works through scientific understanding of that, we no longer require God anymore. And that ties into his fabulous saying as well, God is dead and we have killed him, because in a contemporary understanding and situation, we don't need God in the same way anymore than what we did to have as that fundamental causal explanation for why things occur. And then he also highlights the problem with that, which is quite interesting because it could fit into contemporary arguments as well, where he says suddenly you have the scientific understanding and approach and explanation for doing things, and then you'll have precisely the faith-based approach that then tries to challenge the scientific one. And Nietzsche's very much on, of course, on the side of science here, and they're trying to argue for the harm that faith-based approach would be if you would then try to say, well, science is wrong there because. And one example we can use to highlight that is, of course, the famous discussion and debate between religion and science on creation and the origin of the world. And so from Nietzsche's point of view, you would be able to criticize the faith-based approach, or at least the Christian one that he emphasizes as well, that comes from Genesis 1:1, where God creates the world in 6 days, and then on the seventh, God makes it a holy day. And Nietzsche's then going to be much more on the scientific side, where it's going to argue for, in contemporary society, of the Big Bang Theory, in which it argues that it's the current leading explanation about how the universe began, and at its simplest, it says the universe as we know it started with a small singularity that then inflated over the next 13.8 billion years to the cosmos that we know it today. Because current instruments don't allow astronomers to peer back at the universe's birth, much of what we understand about the Big Bang Theory comes from mathematical formulas and models. Astronomers can, however, see the echo of the expansion through a phenomena known as the cosmic microwave background. While the majority of the astronomical community accepts the theory, there are some theorists who have alternative explanations besides the Big Bang, such as eternal inflation or an oscillating universe, and that's from space.com. And so, for those two contrasting theories, then we can say Nietzsche more or less has the argument once there's the scientific theory established, we lose the significance and meaning for faith in God to have the role there, and we need to make way for the scientific understanding to take place and not to have another hole filled in by God, but rather we can cover that hole in by science. And then lastly, Nietzsche touches upon the differences between, he says the Redeemer there, but it's clearly a reference to Jesus Christ and the Superman, in the sense of with religion and Christ as the prophet in the model and for Christianity, what is ultimately that led humanity to, at the end of this section, we can see being in shackles, bondaged, and ultimately reflecting upon ourselves in a very negative way because we're focused upon death and the afterlife. And what do we need to do? Is he so likes to repeat himself as well, although he's not said it explicitly here, is that man needs to be overcome and free himself from those shackles. How do you get towards that? Through the Superman, in which he says, well, there's been no man that's ultimately been a Superman. It's easy to see why, because we've always been shackled up, basically. And the way in which we get towards that basis is then trying to break free from those shackles, recognizing those problems that we have in the faith-based approach through the emphasis upon faith when it should be upon science at times as well, recognizing the harm that we can do to ourselves as well if we solely focus upon death and metaphysics in the afterlife, and rather we should be moving all back into life, the world, the body, and the here and now. Many thanks for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed my discussion of the sections of the compassionate and of the priests in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Feel free to drop me an email at my address, dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com, and I can be also found on Twitter at I am a rubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I'll hope you'll join me next time.